This is video 2 in the series geared towards people who are just getting into lockpicking. Now in the previous video we discussed the use of plastic locks to learn about lockpicking. And as we discussed, I'm not a big fan of those as far as doing any picking itself. Now they're great again for showing the inner workings of a lock and the different pins, but when it comes to working on your skills picking a lock, I recommend something different. As you can see here, we've got a lock on the table, and this is the Kwikset 660. Now the 660 is a deadbolt intended for a front door or something of that nature. Now I've already prepped this lock. There's a bar that's normally installed on the back of the lock in this vicinity that interacts with the inner handle. That would be this piece. I've gone ahead and removed that to make life a little easier. So let's talk about why this is a good starter lock. Well, number one, it represents reality. The materials inside this lock are what you're typically going to encounter in the wild, as I like to say, and therefore the friction inside here is going to mirror what you're going to see out of many other locks. So first we verify that the lock functions, both keys work properly. So why this one? Why not a different lock? Well, the advantage to the 660 is the fact that it has a couple things going for it. Number one is the fact that I can actually remove the pins from this lock and repin it myself by simply removing this cover. It makes working with this lock very easy. Most locks don't have this. This is usually cast. So that's number one. Number two is the fact that this includes security pins. So when we're dealing with pins inside of a lock, there are a couple different types. Most of them are just smooth cylinders. That's your typical pin. However, there are security pins which oftentimes will have various shapes to them. They'll have grooves cut around their circumference, things of that nature to make picking a little bit more difficult. This particular lock, right out of the box, has 2 security pins, and then the rest are going to be your typical pins, your standard pins. So what we're going to do is we're going to disassemble this lock and look at some of the pins. So this cover just snaps in place. What I'm going to do is take a screwdriver, slip it up underneath here. You can see I've lifted it, and now I'm going to remove that cover. Beneath it you can see the springs for each one of the pins. So what we're looking at is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pins. Now that's important because a lot of the padlocks that you buy are only going to have 4 pins. This one having 5, this is going to be most of your residential locks as well as some of your higher security locks. When you start getting beyond this, then you start looking at 6 pin locks. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to remove some of these pins. Now in my case, I don't care whether or not this key ever works this lock again. I can always rekey it, put it back together, that's no problem. But right now, for the purposes of practice, I don't care if the key ever works. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to dump this. And you can see the pins start coming out. Now when we start working with locks, you're going to find that there are a couple different pin types. You've got your driver pins, which are the ones that the springs work upon, like so. And then below that you've got your key pins. And your key pins are generally the ones that are going to vary in size. So this is how it's arranged inside the lock body. You've got your key pin, which pushes upon your driver pin, which must compress a spring. So when you put your key in, that's exactly what's happening. And as you do this, what you're going to find is that all of these pins are going to line up. So with the key in, that line between the key pin and the driver pin will be perfectly flat or horizontal or straight. That is where your cylinder is going to be allowed to rotate. Let me get the rest of these out. There we go. So we have our pins out. Now again, your driver pins are generally going to be one size or one height. It is your key pins that are going to vary in height or length based upon the cuts that are made in the key. That's called the key's bitting. So right now, Just by disassembling this lock, you're learning about the internal components. Now the other thing we can do is we can go ahead and remove this C-clip. At that point we're going to be able to see inside, or remove the core to look inside of it. Okay, so we've removed the C-clip, and now with all the pins out we can remove the core. So if we look, we've got our holes for our key pins in the core, and then in the body itself we have the holes for the driver pins and the springs. Now when we put the key in, all of the pins in the core should be flush with the upper surface. This allows it to rotate within the lock body. When we remove the key, what will happen is the springs will push the driver pins down in here on top of the key pins, and because those stand proud or tall above this surface, this will not be allowed to rotate. So again, putting the key in, these pins are going to be flush. So what I'm going to do is we're going to look at the bitting, and we can see that this is the deepest cut in the key. And if we compare that, we can see that aligns with the second hole in. So because that's the deepest cut in the key, deepest bitting, we know that is going to be the taller key pin. So we're going to take this key pin, install it in, and watch what happens. So right now, if I was to put a driver pin in here, you'd see that the driver pin would stand tall, and that would lock this. It would prevent it from moving. However, when I put the key in, now that is flush. That would push the driver pin up into the lock body and out of the way, and therefore the lock would rotate and open. Now this has got a little bit of oil or grease on it from the manufacturing process, so again you can see that pin is recessed. When I put the key in, that pin is now flush with the top surface. That would move your driver pin out of the way, allowing this to rotate. Now the reason I didn't care about this working with the key is because what we're going to do is we're going to install just one pin set. So in this case, we'll go ahead and pick one at random. Again, we don't care if it works the way it did before. So here's a driver pin, a key pin. We're going to install that in the first position. We're going to install the lock, or the core, in the lock body, and then in the first hole we're going to put in a driver pin. So now we're going to install the driver pin in the first hole as well. So now we have a key pin and a driver pin, but only in the first hole. Now we take our spring, put that on top, and again, it doesn't matter if it's what came out of that hole originally. We don't care about that. And now at this point we're going to go ahead and put our cap back on, and this just snaps in place. You can hear it snap. Now that is locked. And what you'll find is the core will no longer rotate. You only have the one pin in there. Now I can take a lock pick and I can feel that pin. It's right up at the front, and I can move it and feel the friction of it within the body. And if I want to, I can now use that to practice my lock picking technique. So we're going to go ahead and put a tension rod in here, or a tension lever. Doing this upside down, a little difficult. There we go. So we're now tensioning that lock, and I can go in here and I can find that first pin and just apply a little pressure, and there it goes. So what this gives you the ability to do is, without dealing with all these other pins, is just to get used to, number one, what's it feel like to find the pin with a pick? And number two, how far do I have to depress that pin with the pick? What does it feel like? The other thing that helps me work on is the tension on my tension bar. If I apply a lot of tension, what you're going to find is it's harder to push the pin in, but when you do successfully get it to the right spot, listen. Helps if I get this on there. Here we go. Hear that? Nice click. Now, tension is going to be an important part of your picking process. The pick itself is part of the job, but the tension on this bar is going to have a huge impact on how hard or easy it is to pick a lock. So for example, we were talking about security pins. This pin is a spool pin. You'll notice there's a groove cut in the center. This pin, on the other hand, is just a standard pin. You'll notice it is perfectly smooth. Spool pins will act differently inside a lock when you're picking it than your typical smooth pin. So again, when you go through here and you install just a one pin set, instead of putting in a normal smooth driver pin, you can put in this spool pin, and now you can work on that and see exactly how that spool pin feels when you pick it. So again, work on your tension, get a feel for the friction. How far do you have to move that pin? Because one of the things you want to avoid is oversetting the pin, which is where you push the pin too far up into the lock body. So I'm going to take this pin, push it all the way up in there, and notice I'm bending this rod. It will not move. And that's because what I've done is taken my key pin and pushed it so far up that now this driver pin is out of the way, and this is now blocking the core from rotating within the lock body. So you have to work on getting the right tension and pushing that pin just as far as required to get that lock unlocked. So let's go ahead and pull the cap off again. Remove the spring. And what we're going to do in this case is I'm going to remove just the driver pin. So there's my driver pin. And now I'm going to replace that driver pin with a spool pin. So here's our spool pin. That'll go in. I can put a spring back in there. There's my spring. Rotate the lock body. That's locked again. And put my cover back on. Snaps back in place. Everything's good. So at this point it is locked. Now what you'll find with these pins, with the spool pins, and there's a second one here, right here. That groove in the spool pins, when it gets between, when it falls down and it's the one pin that's keeping this from rotating, a spool pin allows more play in the rotation of the core within the lock than a normal pin. So we're going to put our tension wrench back in. And what you're going to find is when you go to compress a spool pin as opposed to a regular pin, if I apply too much tension, it isn't going to move, because what it wants to do is counter rotate the core. So I'm going to apply very light tension. If it pushes back, I'm going to let it push back, but I'm going to maintain a little bit of tension. See, I just overset that. That's the difficult part about spool pins, is it's very easy to overset them. There we go. So again, when you're working with a spool pin, it's actually going to push back at you. You have to allow that counter rotation in order to set the spool pin. So again, the fact that you can remove pins and put them in any order that you want allows you to work with them. And again, it's realistic. The friction that you're going to run into, the counter rotation that you're going to run into, these are all things that you're going to find in regular store-bought locks. Whereas what you're going to encounter inside this lock is not reality. The friction of the pin against that plastic is way too slick, way too smooth, and you're just not going to get a feel for it. Again, the other problem you run into is the tolerances within this to fit and finish are horrible, and as a result, you may only need to pick 2 of the pins in here, and suddenly the lock is open. So as you work with just a single pen and you become successful with that, now you can start installing the other pens. And that's why I think this is a really good option for working on your lock picking skills. It will grow with you over time. And because you can't see what the pens are doing inside of here, you're not cheating. You're relying on that feel, which is crucial. So again, that's the Kwikset 660. It's the one that I recommend for beginner lock pickers as well as experienced lock pickers, just to work on your craft. I hope this is helpful.